Yep,
Oh, okay. All right.
great. Okay, so welcome everyone. We've got about 20 folks on so far. We're going to get started. For those that came in a bit early, thanks for your patience with our tech issues. We are really excited that this is our fourth and final webinar in our 2021 Rancher Roundtable series for January and February. This four-part series, it's a partnership between the Madison Valley Ranchlands Group, MSU Extension, the Ruby Valley Conservation District, and the Madison Conservation District. Friendly reminder to folks while they're listening right now to keep your video off and mute your microphone. And we will encourage you throughout Dave's presentation to use the chat box for questions. But the way we're going to handle it this time is you can ask your questions throughout. I will be monitoring your questions. And when Dave is totally done with his presentation, we'll engage in that Q&A. And so then I will read him your questions. So feel free to pop in questions in the chat when you think of it, but we will get to them at the end of the presentation. So tonight we are welcoming Dave Scott, and the presentation title is Grazing to Improve Soil Health, a case study in Jefferson County. Our previous three talks that we've done over the last month or month and a half are all recorded and on YouTube. So if anyone is interested in getting a link to those, just pop it in the chat and let us know, and we can email it to you or put those links in the chat. And the content area there that we've covered includes real world first aid kits, including tourniquets and packing gauze. The second one was about calving and difficult births. And the third one we covered was grasshopper and integrated pest management for grasshoppers, as we predict another challenging year with grasshopper management in this part of the state. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Dave Scott. Dave Scott has over 35 years of experience with intensive multi-paddock grazing, first with dairy cows and the last 17 years with sheep. Presently, he and his wife operate Montana Highland Lamb with 200 ewes and 320 lambs grazing 32 acres of irrigated pasture in southwest Montana. For the past 7 years, Dave and Jenny have successfully transitioned their pastures to a regenerative system that has eliminated nitrogen fertilization and reduced irrigation labor and energy costs by 25%, while producing 6 to 7 tons of dry matter per acre in a 120-day growing season. Concurrently, controlling small ruminant internal parasites through those innovative grazing strategies has been a top priority for them. Dave is also a recently retired livestock specialist for the National Center for Appropriate Technology and the ATRA program. He contributed practical how-to publications and videos for the Sustainable Farmer and Rancher, direct marketing lamb, and implementing adaptive grazing practices to build soil health and lessen inputs are Dave's chief topics of outreach. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dave to get started on his presentation. Welcome, Dave.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kalina. And I wanted to thank MSU Extension and the Madison Valley Ranchlands Group and the Madison Conservation District and the Ruby Valley Conservation District for inviting me on today. And what I'd like to visit with you about is just our journey on our farm with 32 acres of irrigated pasture from a more conventional pasture type situation to a situation that features soil function and regenerative grazing. There's lots of resources out there for you. State extension and county extension is one of the top on my list. There's private contractors that are good to employ sometimes, and perhaps a lesser known one, but I'd like to bring it to the fore today because when I started working for NCAT, this is what all this material that we're going to go over today has sourced. And so if you're interested in a really brief little video on regenerative grazing, kind of features our farm, you can just Google ATTRA, ATTRA, and then go to the grazing section, and there's a video called What Regenerative Grazing Can Do for You, and it's about 10 minutes long and kind of gives you bird's eye view of what we're talking about today. If I had known about ATTRA 20 years ago, I feel like our ranch would have really benefited. So I urge you to take a look. Everything on the ATTRA site is a free download. And if your ranch is like our ranch, your ranch will never be the same. I wanted to put a plug in for the Soil Health Innovations Conference, March 8th to 9th, that MSU and NCAT are putting on. And you can find it just by Googling Soil Innovation Conference 2021. It costs $25. It's a virtual conference, and it's 2 days, March 8th and 9th. Pretty good deal. We have nationally known speakers presenting. Before we get too started in here, I just wanted to answer the basic question that a lot of people ask us is, why do we have sheep? And this is my answer. This is why when we quit dairy cows in 2003 and started looking around on a species to use, we chose sheep because sheep have the potential of weaning the weight of the ewe. And I have lots of good friends in the cattle industry, and I love them all. But can cattle do it? And the answer is no. So we wean about 770 weaned pounds of lamb per acre of grass, and we feel we've just started to reach the potential. We're trying to increase that each year. A basic question that one needs to answer when you start is, what's more profitable, pounds of meat per acre or pounds of meat per cow? And everybody has to answer this in their own way. And this slide here is Sheppa, our guardian dog, thinks she knows the answer, and she's telling our granddaughter Ruth. And we are operating under the principle that it's more profitable to wean pounds of lamb per acre than it is pounds of lamb per ewe. This is a brief history of our place. 1982 to 2003, we were a grazing dairy, and we operated under 22 days of pasture rest. We sold the cows in 2003. In 2004, we bought 180 ewes, and we figured what was good enough for cows had to be good enough for sheep as far as grazing goes. And within 5 years, we figured out we were wrong. We had tremendous amounts of internal parasites, mainly the barber pole worm, and also lots of problems like fly strike. The grass was just too lush. So we switched in 2010 to 32 days of pasture rest, and that almost eliminated our barber pole worm problem. And the sheep seem to be much better in terms of the manure coming out of them. They weren't as washy. So then we kind of were always had in the back of our mind, it was costing us too much to grow a ton of grass, and one of the biggest costs was fertilizer. And so one of the people I've met through NCAT, Gabe Brown and Christine Jones, I listened to them at conferences, and they were directly talking about cutting input costs and how you can do it. And that is what set us on our little journey of getting out of the fertilizer business. Started in 2014. Our seasons are active grazing about 4 months. We graze stockpiled grass for 3 months, generally to the end of January. And in Whitehall here, we can generally count on a month or so of snow that can look like this last bottom picture, 12 to 18 inches worth of snow for a while. And there's a way to manage it so that our sheep will just do fine on it. They'll just dig down there. Here's our grazing schedule. We lamb in April, usually the first or second week. May 7 to 17, we turn out on grass, depending on how cold the spring is and how much grass growth we have. August 1, we wean the lambs off the ewes, and the ewes go off the farm to eat leafy spurge on a couple different places. The lambs stay on the grass until September, Labor Day weekend or so. And then everybody's off the pasture first week in September. The lambs go into the corrals, and they are finished for our direct market program. And October 15th, the ewes return from eating spurge. November 1, they're bred on stockpile grass. And generally, the 25th to 28th, maybe the 1st of February sometimes. That's the end of our grazing season. So one of the things that we did when we were trying to figure out how we can use less fertilizer is we started with what our income was and what our expenses were. And we used just a very simple method called gross margin. And all gross margin is the amount of money that comes into your pocket minus the amount of money that goes out. And this doesn't take into account any fixed costs like land costs or, pivot costs or things like that. And so obviously you cannot compare gross margin on two different farms or ranches, but you can compare on your own place with your own set of situations and circumstances, two different grazing strategies, and that's what we did. So in 2009, this was our gross income. We had about 1.7 lambs per exposed ewe. We had 10% mortality, and so that equaled, if you run that out at $1.60 a pound, $190 a ewe. And in 2009, we were running a little over about 5.5 ewes per acre. So that was giving us about $1,000 an acre of gross income. And this is just for the pasture. So when we go further on our gross margin, we were growing in 2009, 22-inch grass on 20 days of rest. And we moved into a daily paddock. So we're moving every day. And these were our costs. Irrigation power was $125. Fertilizer was about the same. Fencing labor at $20 an hour for myself to move the fence a day. Took me about 45 minutes. Was $56 an acre. Irrigation labor, mostly moving hand lines, was a little under $200. Gave us a total cost of $499 per acre. So if you subtract that from our gross income of $1,064, you get the gross margin of $565. And we do add a stockpile credit for stockpile grazing. And we had 90 head that grazed 70 days. So that was about at $1 or $140 a ton. That worked out to about $68. So the total gross margin for 22-day rest was $633 an acre. Now let's compare that to what we ended up doing. The last 7 years, we did take 4 years to transition to this newer system of grazing tall grass. And these figures are from actually 2020, but we were about 3 feet grass, 42 days of rest. We moved daily, just the same as we used to. Our irrigation power was decreased by 25% because we were leaving a lot of trampled grass, and that is essentially a roof on top of your soil. So it keeps the soil moisture in. Our fertilizer has been reduced to $0. Fencing labor is the same, and our irrigation labor is about 25% less too because, excuse me, because we are now on a 10-day irrigation cycle instead of a 7-day that we were previously in the old system. So our gross margin comes out to $782. If you take 282 from 1064, it's 782, and then we add a stockpiled credit. We are now able to graze 180 ewes for 90 days instead of just 90 ewes for 70 days. So it made a big difference. Excuse me. And the reason there is because our grazing wedge is just so much greater because we're grazing taller grass all throughout the season. So when we stop in September, we've got a much more grass out there than we used to. So our gross margin for 2021 was $959 an acre. And you compare that to what we used to do with short grass grazing and fertilizer versus tall grass grazing and no fertilizer, there's about $300 an acre difference there. So we are very happy with this new system. And this last year was our 5th year of no fertilizer. So what will it take for $1,000 of gross margin per acre? It takes our 177 or 70% conception. We're leaving that figure alone. We'd like to improve that, and hopefully we will. But we're concentrating on the costs. And these costs are regulated by these three strategies right here: long rest period, high stock density, and managed residual or trampled grass. So how does this work? You know, if somebody would have told me 10 years ago that this was possible, I would have said they're just plain crazy. You know, but I've proven myself wrong. And the reason why it works is because of the 5 principles of soil health. And they are less or no disturbance, and the disturbance is tillage, pesticides, or fertilizer. There's a year-long living root in the soil. That's going to be a given for a perennial pasture. But the only thing is, we got to remember that we can't overgraze that perennial pasture, because when we start doing that, that year-long root gets smaller and smaller. And those roots are what we are depending upon to put out root exudates from the plant into the soil to feed the microbes in the soil, and the microbes bring back nutrients to the plant. So we want those living roots. We want soil covered with litter. In our case, that's trampled grass. We want a diversity of species. And I have to really emphasize that this is where we're lacking. We have our fields are probably 95% grass. The rest of it is dandelions. And we have a little bit of legumes, but not very much. So the fact that we're able to do this with grass kind of emphasizes the fact that soil microbes are working in our soil for us. Because traditionally, we always are told that in order to provide nitrogen for grass, we need to get a lot of legumes, like 30 or 40% of the stand being legumes, so they can provide nitrogen for the grass. We're not doing that. And so what is doing that is the bacteria and fungi in our soil are providing the nitrogen for the plant. And then, of course, the 5th principle is livestock, and we definitely have that. So let's go through the 3 main parts of this system. First one, and probably the most important one, is the long rest period. These pictures show a 40 to 42 day rest period. This one with the grain bins on it, that's the first time that pasture is grazed in the season. You'll notice the headed out grass on May 30th. And then 45 days later, it looks like this. And that's about 4,000 to 4,200 pounds of dry matter per acre right there in that pasture. And you can see the sheep are just waiting to be moved into that paddock. It happened every day in the morning during that particular grazing period. Okay, I wanted to just emphasize too that this tall grass is 59% TDN, 17% crude protein, and the average daily gain is about 0.62 pounds a day. We'll get more into that in just a minute. So here's what the tall grass looks like. This is about taken the end of August. The grass is starting to senesce. But you can see the production there. This is the 3rd grazing on this particular paddock. And we've got 4,500 pounds to the acre right there. Easy. So the benefits of tall grass grazing, we've already talked about less fertilization, less irrigation, and the reason why we can still get good growth on our grass is because the microbes are fixing all the plant nutrients that our grass needs, whether it be nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, all of the plant nutrients, or all the nutrients that plants need, and I think there's close to 200 of them, are being brought to the plants by the soil microbes. And because of this, our plant nutrient density has increased. And for us, for our farm, that's really a help because we sell lamb, and the more nutrient dense your grass is, the tastier the meat is. And so that's something that we didn't even think about when we started this, but we found out that that's true, and we've really benefited from it. Chefs tell us they can tell a difference. The other great benefit of tall grass grazing is more stockpiled grass. We've talked a little bit about that already, and the fact that we can start November 1st when we start grazing our stockpile, we've got easily twice as much grass as we used to in the 22-inch grass we used to graze. There's also a more balanced energy to crude protein in the grass because it's more mature. The lambs do better on it. They don't get so washy, and that leads to less flies and fly strike and less parasites. So there's a whole lot of benefits to tall grass grazing that perhaps, I know in my case, I was never taught in college. And so it was definitely new to me, but I'd never go back to short grass grazing. So I used to think that, you couldn't get any gain on lambs with tall grass, because it's too mature and the crude protein's too low and the energy TDN levels are too low. And that's very true if you take the whole plant into consideration. Like if you were to take this tall grass here and just whop it off at the, a couple, 3 inches from the ground and send it to a forage lab, you would probably come back with a forage test that was around 10 or 11% crude protein and probably, in the high 40s for TDN. And we all know that just isn't gonna, grow much lamb for you or beef. It's just too mature grass and not enough nutrients in it. But what I noticed when we started doing this was the sheep eat the leaves. And they balance out their crude protein with the amount of stem that they eat. So what I did is I just went and collected a whole bunch of leaves from the tall grass, like in this picture here, sent it off to the forage lab, and it came back 59% TDN, 17% crude protein. And this is what we've been averaging for daily gain is 0.62 pounds. So it's kind of like a hidden thing there. You don't really think it's going to work, but then the sheep show you that it will work. In this picture on the right, you can see this Canadian thistle here in the center, and see how they ate all the leaves and left the stalk standing. So it's one of the things that you see in very high stalk densities when you graze them that way. They're going to eat everything out there because they realize if they don't, their buddy will. And so everything gets ate, which is one of the beauties of high stalk density grazing. So how do we get the tall grass in the first place? All we did is we waited one more week to turn out. So this picture here shows about 1,600 pounds of dry matter. And a week before, it was about 800 to 1,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. So we just had to be patient for one more week, buy a little bit more hay, and then we turn out. And it defies logic, but many people have proven it, including ourselves, that if you wait one more week to turn out, you get about a month more grazing in the fall. So that's how we do it. That's how we get that grazing wedge we're talking about with the tall grass, and much more grass at any given point in the pasture season. And then when we end, it also is more of a grazing wedge, about twice as much grass actually. So high stock density is the other thing that we're trying to do out there besides a long rest period. This picture shows roughly 550 animals on 7/10 of an acre. And we get that by moving daily. And it's equivalent to about 70,000 pounds of live weight per acre, which is fairly high for sheep, not quite so high for cattle. But you got to remember that all these sheep out here, a lot of them have twins. We've got quite a bit more feed out there than we do with cows and one calf on their side. So high stock density gives you non-selective grazing. All the weeds, all the grass, all of everything is either ate or trampled out there. And it gives you a uniform distribution of urine and manure. And the other thing that isn't apparent right here, but what is actually happening is the every bite that the ewe or lamb eats, 70% of it, the nutrients in the plant that they ate, goes right out the back end. So we're cycling nutrients here. And this is really a huge distinction between grazing and haying, especially if you don't feed the hay on your pasture ground or your hay ground. You're not cycling anything if you're haying, you're exporting. And so it's a huge advantage that grazing has over haying. The other thing is whenever the flock here eats a plant, it's like a reset button. Because as soon as the leaves are eaten, that plant starts putting out exudates of carbon, mainly sugars, into the soil. And that is stimulating microbial growth and carbon sequestration. Now compare that to the woods in the back of the picture. There might be the same biomass or even more per acre than this pasture, but those trees have no reset button. All the carbon that they're taking the CO2 out of the air and putting into glucose in the, as carbon is either going, some of it's going into the ground and a lot of it's going as wood, trunks and trees, and leaves and stuff, which is fine, but there's nothing all summer that's eating it like grass. And so this is how the prairies were formed and how the soil in the prairie lands over eons of time became so great. And that is what we're trying to mimic with our pasture system. And that is the reason why that nutrients are being cycled back to the plant and why we don't have to use any fertilizer. So here's the third thing, what we're doing besides long rest periods and short and a lot of high stock density is we are eating half and we're trampling half. And what this does is, besides the pathway where carbon goes out the root to feed the soil microbes, we are providing another pathway to feed soil microbes, and that's in the form of trampled grass. So there's two pathways that we're able to feed microbes with tall grass grazing. And if the grass wasn't tall, like if it was just, 20 inches or so, it's so vegetative that when they step on it, it bounces back. Versus when it's taller and more mature, it breaks at the point of the stem just above the ground and it lays flat when you have a lot of high stock density. And the lower picture here is showing that's what happens. This is close to the ground and the soil microbes can get to it to decompose it. So here's another picture of a paddock that was just occupied by the sheep the day before. And you can see the trampled grass. There's not a lot of standing grass there. A lot of it's trampled. And so we're feeding the microbes. And my great-grandfather raised sheep in Indiana. And if he was here today and he would look at this picture, he'd say, oh my goodness, look at all that grass you're wasting. But our answer is that we're not wasting any grass at all because it's feeding the microbes and it's allowing us to cut inputs. So here's another picture here. This picture on the left is about June 20th or so. It's about 40 days from when we started. And look how high the grass is there. It's almost, 40 inches, 45 inches tall. It's really thick. There's close to 4 to 5 tons of dry matter per acre there. And look what happens when we put it in high stock density with just 1 day paddock grazing periods. It's flattened. So there's probably about 3,000, 3,500 pounds of dry matter here that's been trampled. And we rotate where we turn out in the spring every year. So there's a different section of our whole pasture every year that gets this kind of trampled grass to it. Tons of carbon the microbes in the soil have access to. So these two pictures demonstrate what tall grass grazing does in terms of feeding the soil microbes. The tall grass on the left has been photosynthesizing for a long time and has been pumping carbon down into the soil for a long time. And then when we graze it, we trample that grass right close to the ground. So what is actually happening out there in a simplified tale? And this is very simplified, but as farmers and ranchers, we don't need to know the whole story. If we just have a good enough grasp of what's happening where on the soil that we're walking on, we can make many good management decisions and leave all the ins and outs to the scientists. So what the scientists have discovered is that there's basically 4 types of microbes in the soil. There's bacteria and fungi, and they're the grabbers and the immobilizers. They're like little banks that ingest minerals from the soil and from decaying plant matter, and they hold them in their cells. And they don't release those minerals or those nutrients until something eats them, like a predator. And the predators of the soil are protozoa and nematodes. So what happens if we have a bacteria that eats a protein? Let's use nitrogen for an example. Bacteria ingests a protein, and it's ingesting tons of them because bacteria are the most nutrient-dense organisms in the planet for nitrogen. And so when a protozoa comes and eats that bacteria, he's ingested way more nitrogen, about 6 times as much nitrogen as he needs by eating that bacteria. And so if he keeps all that nitrogen in his cell, he dies. So what's he do? He poops it out. And that just so happens, the form that he poops it out in is in nitrates or ammonia ions, which just so happens to be plant available nutrients. That's the form of nitrogen that plants can take in through their roots. So you can see that this is just an amazing system that nature has evolved over eons of time, and how microbes and plants have evolved together and they work together in symphony. But what happens actually down there? The plants are running the show. Through photosynthesis, they are producing sugars out of CO2 and water. And so they got lots of sugars. And with those sugars, they produce leaves and stems and roots. But they produce one more thing. Probably 20 to 30% of all the glucose they produce from photosynthesis, they exude out of their roots. And those are called exudate. So why would a plant do this? Why would a plant expend all this energy just to exude it out of its roots, what it produces? And the answer is it feeds the microbes. But it doesn't do it just shotgun blasting out there. It holds, you might say, the sugar out to the microbe and says, I got sugar and I know you need carbon. And then you eat carbon breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks in between. And I got carbon for you. And I'm going to give this to you if you bring me back what I need in terms of a plant available nutrient, be it nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, whatever the nutrients that they need. The plant's saying, okay, I got sugars, you bring me that. Is it a deal? The microbes bring it back, and the plant gives the microbes the sugar. So that's very simplified, and I don't know much more than that, but I really don't feel like I have to. It's the deal. But what happens when you add fertilizer? The deal's off, because the plants no longer need the exchange of plant nutrients, say N. So why should they give any sugar to the microbes? And they don't. And this has been proven on a microscopic level and a cellular level in the soil. And so the microbes, they either die or they go dormant. And whenever that happens, your soil no longer functions. So basically, it's something that holds the plant up. And that's it. So tall grass grazing gives us exudates and trampled grass. And both these things feed our grass so we don't have to fertilize. This picture here shows trampled grass, what the microbes at work. The green leaves here, they're about, I think 3 weeks or so, 2 to 3 weeks of growth there. And 50 days before that, it was grazed the second time. And you can see the brown leaves there that I've dug up. And that's what you want to see. You don't want to see gray grass, you want to see brown grass, because that means that the microbes are at work decomposing it. And then 40 days before that, you go in the hole there where it says first graze, and you see nothing. Even though it looked like this 40 or 80 days ago with all that trampled grass. So that is what you want to see, because that means that your soil, the microbes in your soil are very active and they're working. So how did we transition to get to where we are now? It wasn't our plan and something that we thought up ourselves. We basically took a recipe and the advice from soil scientists like Christine Jones. If you want to have really good reading, go to her website. It's called amazingcarbon.com. We studied, that's been our textbook, that website. And I was at a conference in 2014 where she outlined for corn farmers how to reduce their nitrogen inputs. And she basically said you can do it in 4 years. And I thought, well, if corn farmers can do it, corn's a grass. So if corn farmers can do it, then grass farmers can do it. And so that's what set us into motion. So in 2014, we reduced our nitrogen fertilization from 160 units of N per acre to 75. And 2015, we got kind of a little bit of cold feet, and so we just kept it at 75. In 2015, we halved that to 32 units of N per acre. And this next one kind of summarizes that. And then in 2016, it was kind of interesting because about a week before the July 4th weekend, when we usually fertilized, I went and called the fertilizer dealer up and I asked him if he had a tote available, and he says, well, not really. And I says, what do you mean? Not really. He says, well, we got one here. And I says, well, does it work? He says, oh yeah, it works. How many times have we heard that before? Anyway, so I said, okay, fill it up. Well, I got halfway through fertilizing our pasture and I got off the tractor and looked, and instead of broadcasting 50 feet like it was supposed to, it only was broadcasting about half that much, about 25 feet. And so I go, oh man, what am I going to do? And I didn't want to go buy more fertilizer and try to piecework where I'd been and where I hadn't been. So I just kept going. And midway through August, this is what the field looked like on about 1.5 acres. You can see the striping where there was no N applied, and then where there was about 72 units applied instead of 36. But the neat thing about it was I walked all through the rest of the pasture and there was no striping. And this 1.5 acres here has been historically the worst ground that we have in our pastures. And so obviously it needed in, but the rest of our pastures didn't. And so this was something that was trying to tell me that we didn't need any more fertilization. And so actually, instead of being mad at the fertilizer dealer, I was feeling pretty good about what he did to me. Because it was like it was very apparent that we did not need to fertilize anymore. So the next year, 2017, we went to 0 units of N, and from then, the last 5 years, we have not applied fertilization at all. So, what do you want to do? Do you want to raise pasture the way we've always done it with fertilizer? Or do it with tall grass grazing that increases your soil health and make $300 an acre? You know, for our little farm of 32 acres, that's $9,000. And the neat thing about it is at the end of the year, for the last 5 years, it's shown up in our bank account. So it's real. So imagine if you had 100 acres of irrigated grass and the cows or the sheep to put on it. And you do this after you transition successfully, you'll have $30,000 more than you used to have. You know, that can go a long way for making some land payments, for bringing a family member into the farm. Say if you have 200 acres of irrigated grass, you know, that's more yet. And so the potential for saving money with tall grass grazing is huge. And I think it can also be applied to someone that's starting out in farming. It's going to give them a lot better start. So I really am happy with what has happened. And I really honestly think that anybody that tries this, your ranch will never really be the same. So with that, I would love to entertain some questions.
Dave, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So we had a couple questions come in, and as I start reading them, other folks that think of questions can throw them in the chat box. So we've got 2 questions that came in from Caroline Nelson. The first one is, give me a moment. We have a pasture that's currently seeded with orchard grass, and we're looking to also seed it with a pasture mix this spring for rotational grazing. What species of grass do you recommend?
And you are in Montana?
Yeah, she's in the Townsend area, Broadwater.
Okay. We have 5 species of grass. We have Regar meadowbrome, or there's other varieties of meadowbrome. They're very much, pretty much all the same. So we have meadowbrome, we have orchard grass, we've got Garrison creeping foxtail, and we have a wheatgrass that has gradually come in over the years, and I don't even know the species of wheatgrass that is. And then we have a little bit of quackgrass. So we have a fair amount of diversity in terms of grass. And that's the other neat thing that I didn't touch on was except for one part of our pasture, about 4 acres, 5 acres, I guess it was, that we reseeded in 2013 because it was kind of getting choked out by quackgrass. Most of the rest of the paddocks in our pasture haven't been reseeded since about 2006, going to 1999. So you really don't have to reseed anymore unless something goes bad like quack. But the neat thing also is if you're tall grass grazing, quack really doesn't overcome you like it does when you're grazing short grass, because it gets smothered out a little bit. So if I was doing it again, what I know now, and there's a part of the pasture that has more quack than I'd like to, I don't even think I'd plow it up anymore. I'd just graze it with tall grass, and I'm pretty sure it would really lessen. So those are the 5 grasses we have. If you're planting a new seeding, I'd recommend putting in some white clover and red clover as a start, as a base, and possibly some sandfoin. Some people would have really good luck with trefoil. These are sandfoin and trefoil are bloat-free legumes, and if you've got enough of them in your legume mix, they will take the bloat out of the alfalfa and the clovers also. So did I answer the question well enough?
She says,
okay. Thank you, Carolyn.
Yeah.
And there was another one too.
There's another one, but I'm going to skip to one that just came in via text message to me because it kind of follows up on the legume comment that you just made. Okay. Donnie wants to know if you're going to establish legumes, what kind, and would the cost of the legumes make sense? He understands the concepts of soil health, but he wants to get some more details on the bottom line.
Yeah. Legumes are tricky. You know, if you one thing that we have learned is if you don't have at least a 35-day rotation or rest period, those legumes are not going to stay in very long. You know, even if you get a good stand, you know, they're going to stay in for 3 or 4 years and then that's it. So even though we want more legumes in our pasture, we're not going to plow up any part of the pasture and reseed legumes. You know, what our plan is we're just going to let them gradually come into the pasture. A lot of times there's plenty of seed in the pasture. The conditions just are not right for it to germinate. And we're hoping that with this tall grass selection and really high stock density, that will stimulate some legumes. And we are seeing some legumes come in that we never planted. You know, they're just in the soil. And if they're given the right conditions, they will sprout. There's people I've talked to, especially with you know, clovers like red clover, trefoil. They put it in mineral, and the cattle or the sheep eat the mineral. It goes right through them, and then they distribute the seed out in the pasture, and that seems to work pretty well for some people. So.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Okay, another question from Caroline. What is the shortest height grass you would let the sheep graze in terms of preventing parasites?
What is the shortest, what?
Height of your grass.
Oh, okay. Yeah, in terms of parasites, and are we talking about sheep parasites or cattle parasites?
I'm assuming sheep.
Okay. Sheep. The things that are recommended in terms of grazing practices to really decrease sheep parasitism, and mainly it's the barber pole worm in the Intermountain West, are 3 things. One is a rest period greater than 35 days. The second one is don't let your paddock grazing period go more than 4 days, because it takes 4 days for the eggs that are shed in the sheep poo to crawl out of the poo, become larvae, and then perch on the leaf of the grass. So if you're out of there before 4 days, then you've just missed the latest crop of larvae. This is the barber pole worm. And the third thing is don't graze lower than 6 inches, because about 80% or more of the larvae are perched in the first 2 to 3 inches of that grass plant. And so what we did is we just chopped it off at 6 inches, so we had a little bit of fudging room there. And when we're grazing at 32 days of pasture rest versus 22 days of pasture rest, we've pretty much almost eliminated deworming. As when we were grazing short grass, that was 22 days of pasture rest, we dewormed every last lamb and ewe on the place every month, or else we started losing lambs. The other thing that we didn't know then was we didn't know how to FAMACHA score. And if you have sheep or goats, I'd sure recommend it going to a FAMACHA scoring workshop and learning how to do that and getting the card. That's the only way you can get the FAMACHA card, is to go to a workshop. And what that does for you is you score the eyelids using the card, and that tells you which sheep are infected and which sheep are not. And you only deworm the ones that are infected, which is generally about 20 to 30% of your flock. And so not only do you save dewormer, you save time deworming everybody. And the big thing is your dewormer is very likely to last a lot longer. We started out in 2004, and by 2009, the dewormer that we used, which was Valvazin, was totally ineffective. And that's when we woke up. We got to do something different. So in answer to your question, if you can graze down to not graze anymore down or below that 6-inch height, you're going to avoid a lot of the ingestion of the parasite larvae, along with a 35-day rest period and getting out of that paddock before 4 days. Those are the 3 rules of avoiding parasites.
Thanks, Dave. Caroline said that's really helpful. Thank you again. She had a worming issue last summer in her first season of rotational grazing. 2 more questions that came in. One that is asking about the benefits of species grazing. Sorry, I just lost my. They're asking about grazing together and some of the benefits
of multi-species grazing.
Yes.
Yeah, multi-species grazing is another way that you can really decrease the parasite load in your sheep or your cows, because most parasites that affect sheep, if the cattle eat them, the larvae, it's a dead end street. So they don't affect the cows and they never get out of the cow. So, and it works the other way too. The sheep eat the cattle parasites, larvae, and they are unaffected. And so they're like, both species are like vacuum cleaners, sucking up the parasite that the other species will be affected by. So it's really a neat idea. The hard part is fencing. You know, cows you can keep in with a 1-wire temporary wire, whereas sheep, it's pretty hard to keep them in that way. And if you can keep them in that way, it's impossible to keep predators out. So you kind of have to use, in my opinion anyway, sheep nets, electric nets, to keep cows and sheep in. And on a smaller pasture system, that works great. But if you've got larger paddocks, it's going to take more time, you know, of course, to move sheep than it is, or move sheep fence, a net, than it is to move 1-wire, temporary wire. It takes me about 45 minutes to move 3 nets and set them up again for the lead fence for the next paddock. It takes about 30 seconds to move a sheep. So we have our our pasture situated, divided with permanent fences so that I never have to move more than 3 nets at a time. And it's really nice because if I had to move 6 or 7 nets every day, I think I'd be a little bit discouraged. So that's why we built permanent fence, so we don't have to move more than 3 nets a day.
Great, thanks, Dave. We have another question that came in, and I'm going to read it, but first I'm just going to let folks know that I'm going to pop an evaluation link in the chat. So before you stop at any point today, click on that survey and just take a couple minutes to take that eval, and we'd really appreciate it. Okay, so this next question is from Keaton Martin. He's a former Arm to Farm Energy Corps member. You might know him from NCAT. He is asking if you are efficiently using, hold on, my chat just got moved. Give me a moment. If you're efficiently using rotations on a daily basis, is that considered mob grazing?
Yeah, hi Keaton, and congratulations for going through the Arm to Farm workshops. Mob grazing is generally considered, a high density grazing system. And it's kind of a generic term. It doesn't say how high your stocking density is. In general, with cattle, it ranges from about 100,000 pounds of live weight per acre to over 1 million. So it's sort of a catch-all term. It's one of those terms that's slowly evolving in the grazing field. There's a lot less talk about mob grazing anymore, and there's more talk about regenerative grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing. But all 3 systems use high stocking density, which means that you're putting a lot of cattle or a lot of sheep on a small paddock, and you're moving them every day or every other day. In order to get, more than 100,000 pounds of beef per acre stocking density, you're going to have to move, probably twice a day. And there's some people out there that got the systems down where they're moving 4 and 5 times a day. And there's technology that's out there that can help you do that. Bat latches are a solar timed gate that you just tell the gate when you want it to open, and make your paddock fencing, your temporary paddock fencing, put the bat latches on it, and then you don't have to go out there to open the fence. It just goes off, fence opens. It's like a spring gate. It opens, makes the sound, and the cattle realize it, and they just file into the next paddock. So there's neat things out there that have come around to making grazing much easier, and you can have much higher stocking rates than we used to be able to do.
Great. We've got another question that came in from Heather. Can you get these benefits on a smaller scale? For example, 10 acres with 3 horses?
Sure. I think you can do it. I know a guy, an NRCS district conservationist, that does it with 5 cows on about 2 acres, or maybe even less. But he puts those 5 cows on a section that's probably, 20 by 30 feet. And he sets that paddock up in the morning. He comes home at lunch and gives them another paddock of the same size, and then does it again at in the evening when he comes home from work. So you can do it on any scale. You just have to be inventive about it. If you've got the things that you have to kind of coordinate is your watering system and your irrigation. If it's an irrigated pasture, you have to integrate the irrigation in with your fencing paddocks, and then you have to be able to supply water as you move your paddocks across the field. Horses are a little bit harder because have you ever seen a horse that doesn't have its head down on the ground? They're always eating. So, and they also can eat more than they need. And so with horses, I've never done horses before, but I think you might need to have to consider of giving them like a day pasture where you can be out there and controlling what they're eating and moving them, enough that they don't overgraze one little spot, and then maybe feed them hay when you're not there in the evening. But I've never done horses, and so I don't know. But the horses are worse than sheep about eating right down to the ground. So, but it's just like sheep. People say that sheep will eat right down to the ground and leave nothing, and that's not true. You just have to, if you put enough of them, on a paddock, they won't do that. They eat from the top down, and when they get to 6 inches, you just move them off into another paddock. So I wish I could be more specific about horses, but I don't have a whole lot of experience with horses, so I'm sorry.
All right. I don't see other questions that have come in yet, but we'll give it another minute or two in case anyone has additional questions they've thought. I'll just remind folks to click on that evaluation link and take our survey to give us some feedback when you have a minute here. Folks are just expressing thank you. And Dave, we really appreciate your time and you sharing your knowledge with us. It's really great.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for tuning in tonight. I've really enjoyed the privilege I've had just visiting with you.
All right, we'll stick around for another minute or two, but folks don't have other questions. Thank you so much for joining, and we'll make sure to get this recording out and post it through our network so you can share it with folks who might not have been able to join.
Yeah. The other thing I might add, Kalina, is the ATRA program features a farm helpline. And so if you have any questions at all about your grazing or anything farm related for that matter, you can just go on the ATRA website, and there's a phone number you can call if you wish to speak in person to an ATRA specialist, or you can just type in your question in the chat box there, and someone will answer you really quickly. And that hotline's open from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. So be sure to use it. I wish I had learned about it a long time before I did. Like in 2009, when we finally figured out that Valbazin as a dewormer was not working anymore, I realized we had to do something different with our grazing strategies. And that winter, I ended up calling a lot of people, farmers and extension agents in the Southeast and the Northeast, because I knew they had barber pole worm problems. And I just talked to enough of them and took the common denominators of what people were doing. And it was longer rest periods and don't graze down below 6 inches. But the funny part about it, when I went to work for NCAT in 2013, they told me the first week or so just to get used to our website and see what we have. And so I did. And the first thing I looked up was how to control barber pole worm. And those 3 things that I spent all winter researching were right there in one publication. So all I had to do was call 30 miles away and get that publication instead of spending all winter trying to synthesize that information. So there's a lot of good stuff at NCAT and the ATRA program, and I urge you to check us out there.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. I don't
Well, thank you, everybody.
Questions? Yeah. And have a great night, everyone.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Dave. Take care.
Thank you.